Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today. If you didn't catch the earlier Ask Me Anything, it was quite cool. Had lots of people from Australia and New Zealand, but that's for you to watch after this one. But anyway, The German-Soviet War, Combat, Occupation and Legacies is a new book of case studies. Links to purchasing the book are, of course, in the description below. One of the editors is with us today, along with one of the contributors. Both are previous World War II TV guests, and this is the first of a series of shows on the channel dealing with some of the subjects covered in the book. I will bring them in now. Good evening or afternoon, you two, Susan and Jeff. Welcome back to World War II TV.
Glad to be back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, and Susan, you hold the record of having one of the most popular ever shows on the channel, which is really cool. That all about the prisoners of war over in the Soviet Union. So that was well done for having that accolade of being in the top 15. So fantastic for you. Jeff, you're languishing mid-table somewhere. I don't know where you are, but anyway, we're glad to have you here. So Jeff, you're the editor of the book. What was the purpose behind it? What was the intention of bringing all these various academics together to look at this subject? Was there a particular theme in mind?
Well, it started with Robert von Maier, my co-editor. He is a former publisher on books on the Second World War, a real advocate for Second World War research and education. And he broached the idea to me. Maybe it's time to do an edited volume, that there's a lot of good work that's being done. And this would be a way of introducing this work to a wider audience. So, yeah, that was its genesis. I then began, canvassing people that I know who are working on the topic. Fortunately, I've been able to meet a large number of academics over the years, older, younger, who have been working on the topic. And so, yeah, we wanted to bring some new perspectives to a larger audience. The book ended up being divided into 3 sections based on the contributors who agreed to participate. The first one looks at the German Vernichtungskrieg, or the War of Annihilation. From my perspective, at least, this is what really differentiates the Germans, or one of the real things that differentiates the German-Soviet War from other wars in the Second World War. Dave Stahel, who I know has appeared on this program several times, wrote a chapter looking at the German retreat from Moscow. And to me, this is one of the great benefits of continuing to do historical research. This was an issue that seemingly had been settled in historiography, and Dave's contribution shows, nope, actually, this was all wrong, that we need to look at this with fresh eyes. So we started off with Dave, but then we got more into the Vernichtungskrieg. We had a great chapter by Ed Westerman on the Holocaust in Latvia. Really a fantastic chapter that looks at different ideas of center versus periphery, challenges the way we think about the development of the Holocaust on the ground. David Harrisville wrote an excellent chapter on how German soldiers understood this war of annihilation that they're waging. And then Maris Rome-McCullough, who's worked on Rostov-on-Don, looking at Soviet and German sources to get at kind of the occupation practices and experiences there. She contributed a really good chapter on what this war of annihilation meant for Soviet POWs. We know that Soviet POWs are one of the largest victim groups of the Nazis. But what we have generally is stuff from the German perspective. She was able to find some Soviet sources and bring the voices of these men to the forefront. So this first section is on Vernichtungskrieg, right? Sets up the way that the war follows after 1941. Our second section looked at the internationalization of the war. And I thought this was a really interesting section for me to read through, is that when we think of the German-Soviet War, right, we think the Germans and the Soviets, as the name implies. Yet there's a lot more going on. And, Second World War, we think of the grand Allied coalition, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets versus the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. Well, on the Eastern Front, we have other countries that are involved. And we have an excellent chapter on Italian participation in the war by Nick Virtue. And frequently when we look at the Italians in the Second World War on the Eastern Front, it's during the Stalingrad campaign. Nick shifts the focus to 1941 and looks at the idea, is Italy waging its own type of Vernichtungskrieg? We have another chapter on Romania. And this one by Dallas Michelbacher is an excellent chapter getting at Romanian prisoner of war policies. As I said, we know what the Germans did and how they treated Soviet POWs. We also know that Romania waged its own war of annihilation, right? Grant Harward, who's been on this show, has spoken about that. But Dallas shows that when we look at the way the Romanians treat prisoners of war, there's something else going on here. So, a muted version of a vernichting waged by the Germans. We have a very interesting chapter on Luxembourg conscripts, who the Germans deemed Volksdeutsche, and then conscripted and forced to go and fight on the Eastern Front. Nina Jans looks at their ego documents, and we get a really interesting view of how these guys understood the war, understood what they were doing, tried to maintain their own identity. Then, of course, when we think about coalition warfare on the Eastern Front, Lend-Lease, Ilya Grunberg has a very detailed chapter on American air power being used by the Soviets in the fight in Ukraine in 43 and 44. And it's eye-opening, especially in the context of current international relations, where the Allied contribution on the Eastern Front is kind of denied in Russia today. And then the last chapter in this section looks at the Polish army that was raised by the Soviets to fight alongside of them. Keith Hahn looks at this idea of, today, Susan and I are going to talk about ideology and economics. He looks at ideology and nationalism and how these two things mix within this Polish force. So that section kind of broadens our understanding of the war and gets it away just from the Germans and the Soviets, but that we have a lot more that's actually going on here on the Eastern Front. The final section is the one that Susan and I are going to talk a little bit about today, and that's ideology and economics. We have a chapter by Jennifer Popowitz that looks at Ukraine, how Nazis viewed Ukraine, how they used it, exploited it, and also how Ukrainians who ended up working for the Germans in Nazi Germany in the forced labor program, how they experienced it. So it's kind of this all-encompassing look at Ukraine during the war. We have a chapter on the evacuations of Kharkiv in 1943, the dual evacuations by Adrian Wettstein. And Adrian shows that the Germans have a learning curve here. I think we think about learning curve a lot in the First World War. Here we can see that the Germans have learned from one experience to go to another, and that this really, we see this in the way that they evacuate, what they choose to do during these evacuations. We have a chapter by Bas Willems, who kind of looks at, all right, we see what the Germans have done in the Soviet Union. Does this behavior change when they get to East Prussia, as they get back into the German homeland? Bas's conclusion is no, it does not, that the German army does many of the same things that it has been doing. Then we have two chapters that look at the reconstruction of the Soviet Union, cities in the Soviet Union. Travis Gray looks at Smolensk. Ian Garner looks at Stalingrad. And again, the clash between economics and ideology. What do the Soviets want to do? What can they do in reality? And then the chapters that Susan and I wrote, which we're going to talk about today. My chapter looks at the German scorched earth retreats in Army Group North during the course of the war and how they evolve over time and what this tells us about German goals. Susan looks at Soviet policies towards German prisoners. And what these tell us about what the Soviets value, what they see as important. So the book is trying to bring together various approaches to the German-Soviet war, ones that perhaps had not received as much attention as they should, ones which are being opened up in these new historical approaches. So that's the goal of the book. It's a hefty book. I'm proud to have been part of it. I think it's a good book, and I think in the next couple of weeks, as the contributors come on your show, I think your audience will find something in there that interests them.
Well, brilliant. That's been a fantastic introduction to it, and I'm going to kind of take on board the fact you said the word annihilation, I think 6 times. It might have been 7. I kind of didn't count the first one. You mentioned the Holocaust 2 or 3 times, and scorched earth, I think, just once. But that, for me, is the central issue of when I have guests on this channel about that, is that it isn't just the one army besting another army in a particular battle to only repeat another battle 2 or 3 weeks down the line. That's what we were covering when we were talking about, for example, the American army crossing the Rhine back in March and April, where it is all about the combat. the annihilation, it's the ideology, it's the venom that is shown by both sides in the Eastern Front, and also just how much it costs, the economics of it all. As we always talk about the distances involved in the Eastern Front, and like in the Pacific, we have to remind ourselves of the is there, and just the fundamental effort of funding it. And also, what we're going to do now, after that brilliant introduction from Jeff, is ask Susan to kind of talk about her chapter, then come back to you, Jeff. Folks, kind of fire away with questions and comments as we always do. But yeah, I'm going to hand over to Susan to kind of do a summary, and then we'll just sort of open it up to a broad conversation. So over to you.
Great, thanks. So, as Jeff said, my chapter looks at Soviet policy towards German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. They were held, the last of the Germans were returned in 1956, so that's 11 years after the end of the Second World War. And the main crux of my research has been trying to understand why they were held for so many years. And ultimately, I argue, based on former Soviet archival sources and a handful of German archival sources, newspapers, and memoirs of returnee POWs, that the Soviets wanted to hold on to any able-bodied German prisoners of war for as long as possible after the war to aid in post-war reconstruction. This isn't to say that there was not ideology involved. This isn't to say that there was not an air or a minor tone of punishment involved. As Jeff stated, it was a war of annihilation. Both sides were incredibly violent towards each other. But the Soviets did not act in an eye for an eye type of revenge, as one might have expected them to do after the amount of destruction that was wrought upon them. So the Soviet Union is technically a victor nation in World War II, but it really emerges almost as a losing power, right? Because 27 million, and that's the more recent conservative estimates, 27 million Soviet citizens died during the Second World War, and the country lost a quarter of its total physical assets, right? Hundreds of cities, towns, villages, factories, farms lay in ruin. Miles, kilometers, tens of thousands of miles, kilometers of roads, railroads were destroyed, right? Scorched earth policies were practiced by both sides for advances and retreats. So Soviet authorities consciously detained those who could work and forced them to work in reconstruction. That was the primary driver for what to do with prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. Some of this was modeled, again, partially on ideology and economic precedent from years before, which I sort of go over a little bit in this chapter as well. The Soviet authorities took some experience that they had from the First World War. They took some conventions that they had from the First World War. They took some understandings and ideas from international conventions, such as the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. The Soviets did not sign the Geneva Convention. They created their own, what they called the provision for prisoners of war, and it was in many ways modeled on the Geneva Convention. Scholars are divided as to why the Soviets did not sign the Geneva Convention. One of the arguments, and I have not been able to verify this one way or the other, but one argument for them not signing it is because the Geneva Convention said that you had to segregate soldiers based on race, and the Soviet Union didn't believe in doing that. So Soviet authorities created their own provision. It said that enlisted men were to be kept separate from officers. Officers were entitled to slightly better treatment. Geneva said you were allowed to use prisoners of war for labor, though it restricted the types of industries they could be used in. The Soviets didn't really pay attention to that industry restriction. There were precedents set or attempts to follow them. So per Geneva and the Soviet provision, you were supposed to feed the captive the equivalent that you would feed, clothe, house that same rank in your own army, right? So if you had a German private, he was to be treated like a Red Army private, or a corporal, or a captain, so on and so forth. The Soviet Union, though, is also a big story of, or it's quite frequent that the government would issue one type of order, but the situation of the country, the reality of that, the day-to-days of the economics, lack of resources, and so on and so forth, meant that whatever was outlined in a provision was not always given, right? So if you were supposed to get X number of grams of bread, you might not have gotten your daily allotment, but that wasn't because they were singling out the Germans because they were angry at the Germans or trying to starve them. It's because nobody had access. There was not enough food, right? The Soviet Union was under extreme rationing during the war for free citizens and soldiers. There was a huge ration policy based on what industry you worked in, right? So if you worked for a defense industry, like you worked in a munitions plant, you got the most food. If you were a child or elderly, you didn't work in a factory, you had a white collar job, you got a reduced ration. So this mindset applied not just to Germans, the idea of rationing and treatment and your allotment based on your position in life, that applied to regular Soviet citizens as well. So it's not like the ideology of the communists hating the fascists is driving their rationing policy. So the other aspect is that there's a little bit of economics and ideology involved with prison camps in the Soviet Union in general, right? A lot of people know about the Gulag, the main camp administration that operated in the Soviet Union. It was created in the late 1920s, and the idea was what or how could they use prisoners for the best of the economy? How do you refashion somebody who has been a criminal in the Soviet Union? There certainly were political prisoners, but there were also regular criminals in the Gulag system, right? Murderers, rapists, thieves, and so on and so forth. If a person could be redeemed, how could you redeem them? And in the Soviet mindset, redemption was through labor and contributing to the construction of socialism. And so right from the get-go, the Gulag is used for major large-scale construction projects. They are able to meet the demands of some of these construction projects that were set forth in the first 5-year plan. And ever since that they realized those goals, the Gulag was tasked with more and more construction projects of that nature. During World War II, the Gulag population severely dwindled, partially because certain men were released to go fight on the front lines. And because of the lack of food, the Gulag was on kind of the lowest rung of the provisioning ladder. They got even worse rations than usual during the Second World War. So the population heavily goes down. After 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad, when the Red Army starts switching from defensive fighting to offensive fighting to capturing truly mass numbers of Germans at massive battles, this suddenly becomes a new population for forced labor. So the Gulag population has been eviscerated. The Germans are then put into the state planning economics for how to do massive labor projects that normally would have been done with some of this criminal convict labor. There is a sense of also needing to refashion the Germans. The German soldiers are going to go home at some point. They come into the Soviet Union as Nazis, as fascists. You have to, in some way, shape, or form, change them before you can release them. And so the German prisoners are also subjected to ideological training. There was an entire department for propaganda, and there were special schools that were set up for German soldiers. Some of them were run by officers or German communists in exile. They created German language documents to then, or films or what have you, plays, newspaper articles, all sorts of different types of informational materials to refashion these men. So all the German prisoners of war, they labor, right? Their main task is to work on loan to a local industry, but they are also being, when they're back at the camp, subjected to newspapers or film reels and training and indoctrination. They're trying to learn that to counteract the many years of Nazi indoctrination that said communism was evil, communism will lead to your destruction, this is something we have to completely stamp out. They have to learn the opposite of that. They have to be retrained. And so the idea is to show that this, contrary to Nazi ideology and propaganda, the Soviet Union was not a place where they would summarily be executed, for example, right? So the German officers told their soldiers, if you're captured, you're going to die, or you're going to go to Siberia, or you're going to go to Siberia, where you will then die. The Soviets then, in return, and this comes from the memoirs too, right? The soldiers will say, "Oh, I was captured. I was put on a train. I thought I was going to go to Siberia. In fact, I was nowhere near Siberia. I was in Moscow. I was in Leningrad. I was in Ukraine. What have you." And they would the soldiers in their memoirs. It's a common thing where they say, "I was captured. I was worried I was going to be shot." That is not the case. The Soviets then had to say, "Look, we didn't shoot you," which is what you thought was going to happen. And perhaps you also thought you were going to be shot because that's what you did routinely to Red Army prisoners who you captured. Now that you're in the Soviet Union, see that it is not evil or terrible, right? They even would do these, they would go so far in certain directions that they would, some prisoners, if they were stationed in Lenin's hometown, for example, they went to the Lenin Birth House Museum. Some prisoners who were housed near Moscow got taken on tours of sites around Moscow, like the Bolshoi, or to see Lenin's tomb, again, to sort of just like kind of soft diplomacy, right? Like, see what's out there. See what the day-to-day is. It might have been a little bit of a Potemkin village from time to time. They might have been showing things that were not as true as they were, but the idea was to counteract Nazi myths, so that when they went back to Germany, and Soviet authorities didn't preference going back to East Germany or West Germany or the Soviet occupation zone before it becomes East Germany. The men were returned to wherever that they were drafted into the army. Like, were you inducted in Munich? You go back home to Munich. Did you come from Berlin? You went back to East Berlin or West Berlin. Did you come from Stuttgart? You go back to Stuttgart, so on and so forth. Soviet authorities did not preference releases to East Germany. More men were released to the western sectors than they were to the east. Everybody was retrained, reindoctrinated in some way, shape, or form. There are also special schools to train men, smaller numbers of men, to be agitators or propagandists or union members, and they went back to all 4 sectors of Germany. We lose the trail of them when they go back to the western sectors, but those ones who were released to East Germany, there were attempts to place these men in those jobs that they were trained for to continue to basically denazify Germany. How do you go forth with Germany after the war? How do you retrain people? Do you have some of them be school teachers? Do you have some of them work for newspapers? Do you have some of them work for government positions? Do you then have them articulate for Soviet-German friendship? The benevolence or the friendship, the wonderfulness of Stalin was a theme that comes up in some of these materials as well. So there is ideology there, but the vast number of the men who are in the Soviet Union, at least through 1949, which is the main push for reconstruction, they are there to labor, to rebuild what has been destroyed. And the emphasis is they've taken a really ghoulish calculus that was developed in the Gulag. What is the minimum ration that you need to give somebody to keep him performing at a certain level of labor for 8 or 10 hours a day of hard labor? What other small inputs do you have to give them in terms of medicine or time off, rest, relaxation activities? What are the bare minimums of all of that to get that person to continue to contribute and not get too weak that they have to be released back to Germany? That's there, that's driving the brunt of their day-to-day. But the ideology is also certainly there because there was a Soviet slogan, Soviet power doesn't punish, it corrects. So we're going to correct the Germans through labor. They're going to rebuild what they destroyed. And by reconstructing the socialist Soviet Union, they're going to transition from bad, evil fascists and Nazis into good socialist citizens. And they can go home to Germany and work to create German socialism to avoid World War III, to avoid a third time of Germany attacking the Soviet Union. This is the mindset, this is what is driving the decisions that Soviet officials are creating. It's not a good situation. I don't mean it to sound like it was a summer camp or fun or an enjoyable experience. It was also incredibly harsh and demanding. But again, it was not just purely revenge-driven violence. Soviet officials wanted to make sure that they came across as taking the high road.
Right. Okay. So a lot to unpack there, and as we can imagine, a lot of questions have come in for you, Susan, because, I'm as you're saying those things, I'm thinking of one of my best friends. His daughter works within the prison system in the UK. So some of the things you're saying about rehabilitation and making people better to return home, that sounds kind of warm and fuzzy at face value. But of course, it not within the terms that you're talking about. So it is. There's this the need to work these people for the minimum amount of rations and stuff is clearly not good. So let's deal with some of the questions or comments that are coming in, because and then we can bring Jeff back in as well. So the first question is, well, David O'Keefe, Professor O'Keefe, is saying, I guess there's re-education and there's re-education, which is an interesting topic there. And but let's deal with a question from David. So he's saying, how much of this is what's the data? How much of this was common and how much of this was propaganda purposes? So this idea of re-education, telling people about the ideals of the socialist communist regime, how much of that is sort of for show, and how much of it is routine across the entire Soviet Union with the Germans or the Axis prisoners they're taking? Do we have ideas on the statistical breakdowns?
If you read my book, I have actual numbers in an entire chapter on that. That is the easiest way to direct that. Off the top of my head, I can't recite the figures. It was a minority of men who went to these special schools intensively to become propagandists. But every single German who went through the system was exposed to some sort of re-education routinely, either in the camps or as part of their train rides back to Germany. So there would be special propagandists on the trains who would then continue to teach or promulgate, the slogans like Soviet-German friendship, German socialism, long live Stalin, those things like that. So they could not escape that. One of the things about prison systems in general, this is not just a Soviet thing, it's different institutions as well, right? You literally have a captive audience. So you have them there, you can subject them to it. To what degree they believe it, to what degree they retain it, it's very much individual. There's one prisoner of war, in his memoir, he wrote that he was selected for one of the schools. He went to the school, he recognized that being in a school was a very cushy placement as opposed to working in a field or working at a construction site. And so he worked very, very, very hard to just internalize everything that they told him to say, to memorize, to spit it back to them, because he saw that as his ticket out. And that is indeed how he was released early from the Soviet Union. And then he said, as soon as I was back home in Germany, I stopped spewing that garbage. I went back to what I wanted to do, my beliefs, what have you. So I'm sure that there was a range. Every person was affected by this differently. Some men probably did believe some of this after some time. Some of them recognized this is the way for self-preservation. They want me to say, long live Lenin. I will say, long live Marxist-Leninism, and maybe I'll get an extra piece of bread or go home early. And some were probably so deeply convicted otherwise through ideology that they refused to give in to this in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
It's hard to say for each person.
Great answer. So the next thing about convincing someone that a new ideology is better than the ideology they already follow is obviously problematic. So Gordy is kind of asking, did they try and tell these prisoners how bad their ideology was first? For example, did they talk about the Holocaust, death, or did they start by selling their own ideology first? Because I'm thinking about me as a human being. I'm going to use the particularly banal idea of supporting a football team because I can't think of anything else bigger. But if someone tells me my football team is crap first, I will react against that. I will go, no. But if someone was trying to sell another football team to me first, I might take that idea. I know that's an incredibly terrible, pathetic analogy, but I can't think of a better one. So how did they go? Did they go about demolishing the Nazi ideology and then building the communist one, or do they start by trying to show what the communists want? Is there an answer to that?
So I haven't read all of the re-education documents. I've seen overviews of some of the documents, and I've seen some of the propaganda leaflets that were dropped on the front lines kind of urging for surrender. So there are two phases of this propaganda campaign. The first phase of the propaganda campaign is while the war is active. There are targeted attempts to get German soldiers to surrender or to try to overthrow Hitler. As soon as the war is over, the emphasis then, the propaganda kind of shifts, like, as you can see, Nazism didn't work. You lost the war. If it were a good, viable ideology, you would have defeated us, but you didn't. So communism is supreme, or Soviet communism is supreme to fascism or Nazism because it won in this physical clash. So some of the American re-education materials are similar to the Soviet re-education materials in that there is a course of study where it goes like, these are the problems or shortcomings of Weimar. These are the problems of Nazism. This is why Nazism failed during the Second World War. This is why, either from the American standpoint, democracy is better, or from the Soviet standpoint, this is how Marxist-Leninism is better.
Okay, fair enough. Couple more questions to go to deal with. So Ian is asking about the same re-indoctrination applying to other members of the Axis. I mean, Jeff, you talked about at the beginning the fact that we are, your book does cover the other elements of evolving the Eastern Front, but did the Soviets have a different attitude to converting, for example, Italians, Romanians, other people? Or was it kind of a one-size-fits-all? You have worn, in a sense, Nazi uniform, so we will treat you as one kind of body of people?
That's a very good question that I don't necessarily have an answer for, because due to my language skills and also the sheer number of the documents that I was tasked with looking at, I just focused on Germans, and I mean like Germans too. I didn't really look at Austrians. They were tallied in slightly different ways in the camps. There were some camps had Germans, Italians, Hungarians, whatever, thrown into the same camp. Some of the camps, just based on the numbers and the statistics, were Germans only. I do know that there's a very good book that came out recently. I think it was called Stalin's Italian Prisoners of War by Maria Teresa. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce her last name. It starts with a G. I think it's like Giusetti, something like that. I'm sorry, Maria Teresa, if you hear me saying this and making a mess of your name. And then there was a book also that came out a few years ago in English about the Japanese prisoners of war in the Soviet Union by Sherzod. I'm blanking on his last name. Sherzod M. Sorry.
No worries.
Those two will have some of those details. I'm pretty sure both of them go into some of the specifics of re-education. So there were attempts, right? You were an enemy. You were an Axis power. You attacked the Soviet Union. This is what was wrong with your Axis power ideology. This is why Soviet ideology is good. That applied to all of the different prisoners. But to what degree it was cookie cutter or tailored for the country, that I can't answer.
Okay, but that proves there's still work to be done in this subject, which is really cool. Oh, we lost Jeff for a second. There's Jeffrey's back again now. The elephant in the room, which David O'Keefe is mentioning, Susan, is the understanding we have of a relatively few German numbers of prisoners coming back to Germany after it was all done within 1950, which of course you dealt with on your previous appearance there. So, I'm going to be devil's advocate now. If this program is all to rehabilitate, use the workforce to reconstruct the Soviet Union, et cetera, why did so many of them not return?
There are a couple of factors for this. One factor is that it depended on when you were captured and how you were captured and what physical status you were in when you were captured, right? So the mortality figures for the Stalingrad captives are abysmal, right? The vast majority of them die. But the vast majority of them also die because they were captured after months of starvation and freezing. They were in really poor physical condition when they're captured by the Soviets. They're also then subjected to poor treatment because the Soviets didn't think that they would capture as many of them as they did, or they didn't plan for what to do with them when they ultimately surrendered, right? So they didn't have a camp built to put them in. They didn't have the resources there upon their immediate capture to properly feed, house, clothe them in the freezing conditions. And I'm not trying to excuse the Soviets for doing that. Yeah. That's just what happened. Later stages of the war, again, it depends on the battle that you're at and how your physical standing is. There's also another problem with the numbers, and I don't have a good, as far as I know, nobody has a good actual physical accounting for the death rates. The Russian archives, when I was there in 2016, 2017, things related to deaths or burials were still restricted. Those documents were not declassified. There also was the issue that because the Soviets didn't sign the Geneva Convention, and because they did not like the Red Cross, because of certain things that the Red Cross did during the Russian Civil War, they were very distrustful of them. The Red Cross was not allowed in to visit the camps. The Red Cross was not allowed in as an intermediary. The Soviets didn't publish lists of who they had in captivity. So the Germans just knew that certain soldiers went missing, but it was unclear if the man who went missing was killed in action or was a prisoner of war, or if he was a prisoner of war, did he die in a camp or not? Some of this was made worse by the fact that in the later stages of the war, the Wehrmacht intentionally lied about killed in action statistics to families because they didn't want families or Germans to become panicked or to lose morale, to give up the fight, right? So the Wehrmacht intentionally suppressed death statistics, or they would potentially say, your husband, son, whatever, is missing in action. We won't tell you that he's dead. So this is something that actually there's a myth of secret camps in the Soviet Union. And this continues in German society, both East and West German, even well past the 50s when the last men come home. Trains of men come home. People still don't know if their husband is alive, father, whatever, their family member is alive or dead because there's no verifiable list. They know that they're missing. The Soviets will neither confirm nor deny that that person was captured or died in captivity. So people, they want their family members to be alive. They hold out the hope. And so they think it's the Soviet Union, it's Stalin, or even after Stalin, right? It's the Soviet Union. They're evil. We're conditioned about this. They've been very deceitful and distrustful. I'm going to hold out hope that there's just a camp in the middle of Siberia that they're not talking about that these men are in. So between what the Soviets do and what the Germans did, there's no really good list. There's no way to knock the names off. And so both sides kind of contribute to this. And so that's also another reason why there are questions about the actual number of prisoners who died in captivity versus did they die before they were taken captive. And that's something that we can't answer unless we get into some restricted archives.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, that's a good response to that. And I think what this is coming down to as the host of World War II TV, a lot of it is to do with language and perceptions. In that, when we're dealing with the Red Army as a military force, we tend to think, or there's this tradition of thinking of it very much as a blunt force. You know, it's that no one cares about human life. It's just death, death, death. And when we've done shows about, for example, H.G. Davey, talking about the transportation and how they would move things up into the line and the systems they had in place, it becomes clear that they aren't quite the blunt force. And so this idea, this notion we have of just cruelty, and as you say in the last show, locking people up in Siberia and the gulags, actually working them for very, very minimal rations with very, very minimal medical care for years and years is just as nasty. It's just a more spread out form of nastiness rather than a speedier cruelty, which I think is fascinating. And it's, you know, one of the comments in the sidebar, the difference in rehabilitation and revenge punishment, the lines blur a little bit about what is more cruel, locking someone up and not working them for 20 years or working them hard for 10 years, physically exerting, and they end up dying 30 years younger because of the treatment which is better and which is worse. So it's I like a discussion like this, Susan, when it raises as many questions as it does answer them, which is a cool one for us on YouTube. And I think, you know, the question came in from Veronica. How did Susan work herself through the archives? Is there any way to sort out chaos? I mean, right now, it's, as you said before going live, getting to the Russian archives is not really possible at all. But when you were there, you know, for those of us who are watching this who have an understanding of the Public Records Office in the UK or the National Archives in the USA, there is a system that is reasonably okay to understand. I'm assuming the Soviet archives are just a big mess. Is that am I wrong?
No, I mean they're very well organized as well. They have their own finding aids and guides. The question is just to what degree have certain things been declassified or not.
Right.
Everything I asked for, every time I went in, with the exception of individual personnel files, right? So they have data protection in the Russian Federation. So I couldn't get a file of a single German unless I were a direct descendant.
Right.
Right. Like I just can't ask for Fritz's file. I'm not related to him.
Okay.
But when I looked at the larger systematic files for the camps, right? So the central documents for the region, for example, or the documents for a particular camp, like a camp in Moscow, I was given that information.
Okay.
The finding aid tells you, like, this is the directory for re-education, here are the files for that. The finding aid says, this is camp number 215 in Ulyanovsk, here are the files that we have for that, and so on and so forth. The issue is that not all of their finding aids were published online.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to physically be there to then ask for the finding aid, like a binder of the information in the folders, and then the archivist would give you that binder, and then the binder would tell you, okay, here are the subfolders in this collection. Which one of the subfolders do you then want to ask to read?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering that. And before, we're going to bring Jeff in as well. Susan, feel free to jump back in later on with some comments as well. But Jeff, before we go to your subject, as the editor of the book, with the various people that wrote chapters about POWs, I'm assuming even for someone like yourself, this was all pretty new research and quite jaw-dropping in some ways, because we do tend to have this very narrow, old-fashioned view of the whole POW experience when we think of the Eastern Front. Am I putting words into your thoughts into your head there, or was it all kind of cool information you were finding out?
Oh no, this was editing this book was a learning process for me with nearly every chapter. Especially, I feel pretty knowledgeable about the German army during the Second World War, but looking at other armies and their other countries and their programs, their policies, the way they went about things. Yeah, no, I learned a lot by editing the book, for sure.
Brilliant. Right. Well, we'll turn to you, Jeff, for the bit of the program you're going to bring, and then we'll do maybe some other questions later on. But Susan, you give me a lot to think about, which is great, because I'm not sleeping very well at the moment anyway. So there'll be something else I will percolate on later. So that's really cool. So Jeff, over to you for your part.
Okay. Well, so my chapter looked at the retreats carried out by Army Group North during the war, starting with the Scorched Earth retreat in 1941 during the winter crisis. The Army had advanced to Tikhvin. As it became clear they couldn't hold it, they were ordered to retreat. I then looked at the retreat from the Demyansk pocket in the spring of 43, and then the final retreat to the Panther line in late 43, early 44. And the way I looked at the retreats was, as we talked about earlier, this idea of Vernichtungskrieg, and we have a really good idea of the German War of Annihilation in 1941. Historians have done excellent work on the various elements of the criminal war that the Germans waged against the Soviet Union, ranging from the Einsatzgruppe in the murder first of male Jews, and then extending that to all Soviet Jews by the fall of 1941. The starvation plan, which anticipates seeing some 30 million Soviet citizens die during the war, which of course leads to the starvation of Leningrad, the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. We have the criminal orders such as the Commissar order, right? The intentional murder of every Soviet political officer that the Germans capture. We have the Barbarossa Directive, which essentially ends military law for the German army, a preemptive amnesty for its soldiers as long as they do their duty at the front. So we know that 1941 is an ideological war that Nazi Germany is waging against the Soviet Union, and that the German army, for all intents and purposes, goes along with it and participates in it. What I wanted to do was take a look at how this develops over the course of the war. As you go through, at least the German records that I've looked at, and I've looked at divisional records for maybe 14 divisions, all of them that I can get my hands on, it becomes clear that this ideological thinking or the ideological rhetoric kind of disappears as you go along. It is heavy in 1941. You certainly see elements of it in 42, 43, and 44. But what we get is a much more pragmatic view of things. Now, when I say pragmatic, this does not mean that it's ethical, that it's moral. What this means is, what does the German army have to do to win the war? And I think the retreats are a good way of taking a look at how the German army understands its position in the war. So 1941, with the retreat from Ticknen, we get orders for a scorched earth retreat, destruction of bridges, destruction of roads, shelter as well. It's the winter. The idea is you can, keep the Red Army out in the cold. But this isn't all that different from, say, the British retreat in Malaya from the Japanese in 1942, right? That these are things that are considered, you can do this in a time of war. We do see, however, a real shift in the spring of 43. And this gets back to one of the things that was brought up in Susan's presentation, the Battle of Stalingrad. With the defeat at Stalingrad, it becomes clear to the German army that the initiative has switched on the Eastern Front. So now when the army retreats, it's not thinking of these as temporary things. These are much more permanent. And we get a set of orders in February 1943, one issued by Hitler, one issued by the Economic Staff East, which kind of set the tone for these retreats going forward. Essentially, they want to bring every able-bodied person with them so they cannot work for the Soviets. Any way, shape, or form. If you can't grab everybody, then you want to get every man between the ages of 15 and 65. So they simply can't be thrown into the Red Army. And then they want to evacuate every economic good that they can. So cattle, wheat, you name it, it's got to go. And if it can't move, it has to be destroyed. So the first time we see these orders put into effect in Army Group North is in the Demyansk pocket. The Demyansk pocket had been formed during the winter crisis by the Soviet counterattack, right on the seam of Army Group North and Army Group Center. So we had this pocket which had existed within Soviet lines. It was connected by a very narrow land bridge that the Germans were able to get some supplies in. Hitler didn't want to give it up because he thought that, we're going to move on Moscow any day now. We want to have this jumping off spot. Well, obviously that never comes to fruition. So he's finally talked into retreating from Demyansk after the Stalingrad defeat, right? That the Germans got to figure out, how do we shorten the line? How do we create reserves to take care of that gigantic mess we have on the southern part of the front? So as the Germans begin preparations for the retreat, what we see is that this is not just a military retreat, but rather this is the utter devastation of an area. That German divisions are all given extensive tasks on what needs to be destroyed. I mean, one division is given a list of, there shouldn't be one bush left standing in your area so that, the Soviets have nowhere to hide. So the Germans begin this massive destructive process and they grab everyone that they can except for the ill. They leave the elderly and the ill behind for the Soviets to have to take care of. So as the Germans retreat out of the Demyansk pocket, it's just as they leave what is proudly referred to as a desert. And what we see here, I think, is the importance of economic thinking, that the Germans realize, all right, the initiative has switched on the Eastern Front. And not only has the initiative switched to the Eastern Front, we have the United States is now involved in this war. We're fighting them in North Africa alongside of the British. We have real problems when it comes to our economic basis, right? That we have to get as many resources as we can, and we have to deny them to our enemy. So we see this in Demyansk. We see this at the simultaneous evacuation from the Rzhev salient. In both cases, the Germans leave nothing behind, right? They utterly devastate this area. At Demyansk, they evacuate some 22,000 people. And what do they do with these people? Well, some of them are used by the army to work on fortifications for the army itself. Others are put to work in the fields behind the Germans to ensure that the German army has enough food. We also see about 8,000 of them are sent back to Germany to work as forced laborers. So the German army has now become part an important part of how the Germans approached the war economically against the Soviet Union. Now, the question is this all economic? Is this ideological? And of course, it's a mixture, right? That when the Germans retreat in France, they're not destroying everything as they go along. Now, some of their retreats from Greece, some retreats that we see in Serbia, pretty terrible. But again, I think there we see that there's an ideological aspect to it that's kind of missing from what we have in this. Now, of course, the Germans, they flood the Netherlands, right? They destroy some areas there that end up flooding sections. I'm not saying that the Germans are carrying out a normal legal war in the West, but certainly what they do in the East is of a different standard. Now, as the war goes on, 43, 44, it's becoming clear that the Soviets have a real advantage when it comes to resources. They simply have more men, they have more materials, they have more weapons. Army Group North has become kind of the showcase army, according to Hitler, because they haven't had a lot of fighting. That the majority of the fight has been in the south, following the Stalingrad battle in Ukraine, and then following Operation Bagration in the center of the front. So Army Group North has been sitting there kind of on its own. Its command realizes that it simply cannot hold the line. If the Soviets do launch an attack, a lot of their units have been drawn off to the other hot spots on the front. So they begin planning their retreat to the Panther Line in the fall of 43. So here the Germans are going to have 3 to 4 months to plan what they want to do. And this results in an extremely systematic and comprehensive plan of destruction and exploitation. Initially, the Germans talk about deporting some 900,000 people, which is an incredible number to write down. They don't come close to this, but nonetheless, this is what they're thinking. So over the course of the next several months, while they're trying to talk Hitler into allowing them to retreat, they are planning the retreat. And we see that German divisions at the front round up people, send them to the rear. During this entire process of getting ready to retreat back to this Panther Line along the old Imperial Russian border, the Germans are going to fill up 978 trains worth of goods that are being evacuated, everything from cattle, potatoes, hay, to any sort of agricultural implement. They even take beehives. Everything that can be moved is put on a train and taken out. Now, what the Germans also do as they retreat is they destroy any sort of installation that could help the Soviets. So anything, any utility, electrical utility, water utilities, destroyed. I've seen lists generated by divisions really talk about individual ovens that need to be destroyed as they pull out. So essentially the idea is to leave nothing of any value for the Soviets. One historian has stated, and I think they're right, that essentially the Germans are trying to cripple the Soviet economy for the next decade. Right? So, one of the questions that was asked to Susan earlier was, did the Soviets show these German prisoners the camps like we see with German civilians in the West? And, my answer would be, they don't have to show them anything because these guys did it, right? They know what they did. They saw it, they were part of it. They know the destruction that they have brought to the Soviet Union. So this idea of them being forced to rebuild it makes all the sense in the world to me, right? That you're the guys who destroyed it. But, to give a sense of what happens in Army Group North's area, 20 cities and over 3,100 villages are severely damaged or completely destroyed. 90% of all industrial installations are wrecked. 70% of all agricultural equipment is wrecked. 44% of the cattle population is gone. Frequently, when the Germans could not evacuate all of the cattle, they'd simply shoot them, let them rot in the fields. One commander issued an order to his guys that everybody has to pull out 3 potato plants in the morning before they get ready to go, right? That this is the granular level of destruction. And here I think we see this really economic understanding of the war, that the German army realizes that this has become a war of material, that they're, the Blitzkrieg, these blitz operations failed in 1941, and that now this has become a war of attrition. Germany's going to lose a war of attrition. It lost in World War I. The fear is going to lose the Second World War this way. So how do we equalize this? And we do this by trying to ravage the Soviet economy. So as they retreat, we see the Germans engage in just wanton destruction all the way back to the border. And, as Bas Wilhelms has written, right, that this continues inside of East Prussia even as well. So, we think about, we place these retreats within the context of the Vernichtungskrieg. I think this actually expands our idea of the Vernichtungskrieg, and it expands it chronologically as well. Right, 1941, the Germans are targeting specific members of the Soviet population: Jews, urbanites, Soviet prisoners of war. By 1944, they're grabbing everybody. Right, they're not murdering them, though. We do have massacres of civilians in, people who won't leave, thrown in a barn, the barn's burned down while they're in there. We have numerous documented cases of this. We have documented cases of the Germans leaving behind large numbers of sick and elderly for the advancing Soviets, right? They're just kind of stuck in no man's land for a while. But they're trying to take everything that they can. And, they're destroying the geography, right? We're getting rid of bushes and trees, anything that the Soviets could hide behind. We're poisoning wells. We're destroying any shelter that's out there. So I think by 1944, the German War of Annihilation has become much more all-encompassing. Ideology clearly plays a part, because as I said, they don't do this in Denmark or the Netherlands or France. But I do think that this is the army trying to figure out a way to equalize the resources in some way. By mid-1944, it's clear this isn't going to happen. And then it just becomes almost a nihilistic war by the Germans. But I do think that if we look at the behavior on these retreats, 41 through 44, we do see a shift within the army thinking in which economics matters. And that's what drives these utterly destructive policies that in many ways fit neatly with what the Nazi ideological vision is, right? This war of annihilation against the Soviet Union.
Well, brilliant stuff. And as can be expected from the fantastic World War II TV sidebar, there's some fantastic questions coming for you, Jeff, but also feel free to jump in as well, Susan. So when you were talking about the 900 plus trains there, Jeff, I couldn't help thinking about the show I did a year or so ago about Britain's trains in World War II, where it was really well organized so that munitions trains were being using the same tracks, but there was all scheduling was all done, and it was all done by, pre-computers, and how you have to have basically the whole country work within the system there. So the questions we've got, I will do them in a particular order they're coming in. So Ian T was asking, wouldn't the trains be running back empty anyway if they were coming east with supplies? So German trains were taking, for example, munitions up the front. Would they be going back empty anyway? So when they're doing the scorched earth stuff, are they putting stuff on the empty trains, or are there special trains being sent to take stuff back as part of the scorched earth policy? So a train related question for you there, Jeff.
My understanding is that, yeah, a lot of these are trains that have been going to the front. I guess the point here was just to say how much stuff is being taken out. Yeah, that they're using whatever resources they have to take as much out of this area as they can. And just filling up train after train after train to do so.
But that also implies, and my question to add on to that would be, if you're talking about the dismantling of ovens and moving animals, all that stuff requires to some extent specialized people. I wouldn't know how to put a cow on a truck. I'm burdened with my vision of scorched earth. These things I've got. I watched the Samuel Goldwyn film North Star yesterday, just because I wanted to. I was doing something yesterday afternoon, and the Soviets the Ukrainians are burning the village so the Germans don't get it. So I think of fire. I think of just sort of immediate reacting in the moment and just denying the enemy in a very, very basic way. But what you're saying implies organization going basically right the way across the Third Reich, and which brings me to the next question that combines. And Pedro also gave a donation, so folks, you can drop a donation if you like. He's saying, Was German economic planning more or less strict than the Allies? E.g., in the US, factories were told what they had to make, workers couldn't quit. Because if you're going to, everything has to work in connection. If you're going to be denying resources to the Soviets because, as you said, it's a war of attrition, you have to make that symbiotic with what's going on within Greater Germany with its own factories. So is there someone kind of overseeing this at a higher level so that logistics and everything is being managed, or is someone in charge with kind of scorched earth separate to what's going on within Germany? Does that make sense? Did I make that question well enough?
No, it makes sense. I guess my first answer would be we don't want to give the Third Reich too much credit for having an orderly administrative structure. There's been a really good book just recently written, Empire of Rags and Bones, which looks at Nazi recycling efforts, and this includes stuff from the battlefields.
Right.
And what I think is very clear is that the German army has developed over the course of the war, 1942 through 44, a system of removing resources from Soviet Union and bringing them behind German lines to be used by the German army. The majority of the stuff that the German army is going to take out in these scorched earth retreats is going to be for army use.
Right.
Some of this will end up being sent back to the Reich for sure. But based on, I only look at the army itself. Based on this book, it seems clear that this stuff is not used in an organized or efficient way. That in fact, this stuff just piles up in various places, broken vehicles, rusted out guns that the Germans are just grabbing everything and taking it back. But it is clear, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, they have these collection groups attached to the panzer units, as well as some infantry units, that go and grab resources as they go. So this has been part of the German war effort since Barbarossa, since June 41. What we do see is, I think, a much more robust structure that develops within the army, how to grab these units and how to grab these resources and how best to exploit them.
Thank you. Great answer. And I can't help referring to when you referred to the British retreat in Malay, or the British Australian retreat, as kind of a scorched earth, because again, it's language. Scorched earth has when it hits my brain, I have a reaction to it. And I'm going to ask you another thing, because when we've talked about the Pacific campaign, which I know is not what we're talking about today, we refer to kind of War Plan Orange and the fact the US were war gaming various scenarios with the Japanese for years before World War II. We know, because we've done shows on the channel before about the Soviet and German exchanges of officers and ideas through the 1920s and 30s. Had anyone on either side sort of predicted that if a war got to the level it did there would be some need for sort of a scorched earth policy? Was it something was ever written down as a means of taking war to the other side before World War II? Or because, you started off talking about 1941, but was it in the consciousness before the war?
That the Germans would wage a scorched earth?
The Germans or the Soviets, that kind of war would lead to that kind of necessary action?
Well, I think most German commanders, as well as most of the world at the time, thought that this was going to be a fairly cut and dry, quick campaign.
Right.
But they had defeated the French so quickly, and the greatest army in the world in France. What would they do to the Soviets, who struggled with Finland? So I don't think many German commanders thought that this is the way that it would develop in 1941. Now, certainly, if you go back and look at Reichswehr, German army in the 20s, and then the way that they thought about war and how they would defend Germany, you see a lot of the same things in their planning documents, that if Germany's attacked by a greater force, this is how we're going to have to fight. And essentially, it's very similar to the way that they fight on the Eastern Front. So there is this thread, I guess you could say, through the German army that talks about, or that understands war from a perspective that when we start to lose, we have to do whatever we have to do to win, right? Regardless of ethical or moral boundaries. So maybe there's a thread there that you could trace.
Okay, thank you. This is a potential rabbit hole, but I'll put it to both of you, and we can either ignore it or deal with it. But Samuel Thomas is asking, doesn't this beg the question of why Hitler did not permit a large, grand tactical withdrawal to a defense line that would have really delayed it and halted the Soviets? I mean, that's a massive, great question that takes us down a massive, great what if there. But do you have an instant reaction to that, Jeff, as the editor of this book and what you've studied in terms of the German army? I know you've spoken about David Stahl and people like that, but was there a better way the Germans could have managed it?
Well, I suppose if we think about, impregnable defensive lines, what was the best one of the Second World War? The most famous defensive line.
Well, I began the Atlantic Wall, I suppose, which didn't work.
Well, Maginot Line. I mean,
Maginot
it seems
Line,
to me that
they don't work.
The Soviets are far more mobile than the Germans are by 1942. So it's going to be hard for the Germans to find a place they can adequately defend and get there in strength before the Soviets get there.
Okay.
I mean, the Panther Line, I think, is the one attempt to create this long defensive line. But this is a defensive line that runs from the Gulf of Finland all the way down towards the Black Sea. Right, it's 1,000 miles long. I mean, how do you defend that? So it's, I think Dave Stiles' work on Moscow shows, this is where allowing the commanders to figure out their own retreat makes a lot of sense, and that this would help the German army. I think it's hard to see how later in the war how the Germans could have stopped the Soviets on the defensive line. Simply didn't have the firepower, the resources to construct one, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. So as we begin to kind of think about winding things down, I mean, I want to kind of bring it back to the two subjects that are in discussion, ideology and economics, because to some extent they sound separate, but you've reminded us that they are inherently connected. And there's this ongoing discussion about whether or not the Holocaust should be taught as part of military history or separately from military history. And for me, you can't separate the two. How can you look at Barbarossa without looking at the ideology, without looking at the purposes behind it? If you don't, you're just playing what I call the top trumps version of comparing, T-34s against Panthers, which is that kind of 12-year-old boy way of looking at World War II, which has no depth and no real no understanding. So to sort of sum things up, both of you have said that it's hard at some points to separate. When does the ideological aspect separate from the economic, and when are they tied together? But with Susan, you first, with regards to your work on the POWs, ideology, economy, I'm assuming this is a branch of study that you'd like to see more work done on this, rather than necessarily, again, just dissecting which is the best tank, which gets nowhere. So, I mean, is this an area that you think needs more work?
In some ways, yes, certainly. I mean, just boiling it down to the simplest, though, right? We're talking about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Marxist-Leninism, Marxism in general, that is ideology and economics all rolled into one. You can't understand the Soviet Union, you can't understand the Soviet war effort without that, right? That Marxist ideology is driving all of their planning. I mean, does it drive like man-to-man on the battlefield? The ideology might not be, Marxism might not be driving that, right? It's kill or be killed, right? But like, what is shaping the thought processes of the highest commanders, leaders in the country, you can't extract it. The ideology and economics are completely interwoven. So you need to emphasize that to truly understand the Soviet point of view or framework for the decisions that they're making during the war. Also, T-34 tanks are cool. I just have to say that.
Well, I mean, they're not.
Heckle some people angry. I have to say, T-34 is the Soviet historian.
But I mean, that's the thing is that I'm pretentiously saying that I'm pretending that I don't indulge in those conversations, but I'd be lying if of course I do. Of course I talk about which tanks are cool and which aircraft are tall and blah blah blah, because that I am who I am. But Jeff, as editor of the book again, along with your co-editor there, this the title of the book, Combat, and then you Legacies, and they obviously all overlap. Everything overlaps. So how difficult is it as an editor to go, okay, this should really go under this category, but it's still got one foot in that category. Is that a complicated process?
Well, for sure. I mean, there's 3 chapters on prisoner of war policy, and they're all in different sections, right?
Yeah.
That they easily could have been combined in one. And that's I think that's a great point. That when we think, especially we think about the German war in the last 20 years, 25 years, maybe 30 now. I guess I'm getting older. Ideology has become the driving thing of everything, right? That before we looked at the German-Soviet war, the immediate post-war era up through the 70s, it was, as we were talking about earlier, right, just big battles. And now it's become this ideological confrontation. And both of those things are true. They were massive battles, right? I mean, battles that dwarfed anything else in the Second World War. This was an ideological confrontation between 2 ideologies that viewed the other as their mortal enemy, with good reason. But it's also, we don't want to lose sight of other factors that drive behavior, that drive motivations. And recently there's been work showing how important economics were to the German decision to invade the Soviet Union. And I think when you look at the German army's policies and practices in particular in the Soviet Union, you see that it's thinking about resources, that this is its major issue. It wants to destroy Judeo-Bolshevism, but it really would rather have those mines and that oil and that wheat, right? That's what it needs to win the war. So, the book, I think, it shows that, you're right. All these things are tied together. That you can talk about combat in the Second World War without talking about occupation, but you're missing a lot, right? That the occupation tells us more about what these countries want to do, what they're trying to achieve, why they went to war, than the actual combat does.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that the discussions about the best armor from World War II, there's no new data. It's no longer relevant except as a kind of a pub conversation. But rival ideologies and why people are behind ideologies is exactly what we should be talking about here in 2025. That the world is. That's the world we are right in now, with rival ideologies. I'm not making direct, exact comparisons to anything going on now with World War II. I'm making indirect, but nevertheless, they are there. That we people are divided by ideologies. So therefore, these discussions are relevant today. Whereas ultimately, I say T-34s, Shermans, and Tigers, it's all 80 years ago, so it doesn't really matter. But understanding how everything ties together, ideology, economics, politics, and warmongering is very much a hot topic. So, well, I think we will leave things there. Jeff and Susan, great things to think about from this show there. Any final words you want to say before we bring things to an end, Susan or Jeff?
It's a good book. You should buy it.
It's a good book. You should buy it. Yeah, but fair enough. No problem at all.
Buy lots of copies.
Buy lots of, because they're so big. You can always use them to kind of fill up spaces in walls. They can use them for reinforcement of structures as well. I haven't. It's a doorstep like a Peter Caddick Adams. So there we are. So fantastic. Tomorrow, Ian Garner's on talking about Stalingrad, and then progressively over the next few weeks, we have more and more shows based on this book coming your way. I'm looking forward to hosting those. But in the meantime, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jeff. As always, buy my guests' books, visit their websites, read their blogs, become a patron, become a channel member, but most importantly, buy their books. Otherwise, they won't write more ones in the future. So that's the main reason. Keep them working, keep them happy. So cheers, everybody. I will see you all tomorrow. Meanwhile, this is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.